Lately, I have been very interested in aesthetics and how aesthetics can be essentially applied to non-Western civilizations or non-Western philosophical thought. And aesthetics, as defined by Britannica Dictionary, is essentially the study of art and beauty. Actually, it's the philosophical study of art and beauty. And you can see Tofu just grabbing my hand. Isn't he cute?
What I noticed is that Western aesthetic theory has long traditionally conceived art in terms of conceptions of beauty, disinterested contemplation, and individual taste. This thus separates the relationships between aesthetics and ethics, aesthetics and metaphysics, and aesthetics and politics. Mexican aesthetics, in contrast, emerge under radically different historical and ontological conditions, indigenous cosmologies, colonial dislocation, and ongoing struggles over identity and power. Rather than perceiving art as an autonomous field that primarily concerns itself with beauty, Mexican aesthetics traditions understand artistic expression as a form of knowledge, ritual speech, historical memory, and collective resistance. I would argue that Mexican philosophy collapses the Western separation between art and life through a conception of artistic practices as epistemic and ethical practices embedded in communal experience. So, based on the indigenous Nahuatl philosophy, Mexican poetry, post-revolutionary thought, and visual art, and in particular, muralism, I believe that Mexican aesthetics depends on historical circumstance and lived continuity rather than abstract or universal ideals of beauty. One of the foundational concepts in getting to understand Mexican aesthetics is the Nahuatl phase, the flower and song, referring not only to poetry or ornamentation, but a divine form of truth-telling. In Nahuatl philosophy prior to the Hispanic conquest, beauty cannot be considered outside of knowledge or moral disposition. Artistic work was a way of approaching the truth or rootedness in a world perceived as weak and transient. Poetry, song, and visual symbolism were epistemic practices that enabled human beings to temporarily participate in cosmic order. Nahuatl poets, such as Miguel León Portilla, did not take aesthetic pleasure in isolation, but posed ontological questions with metaphor and rhythm. Quote, "Is it true that the earth one lives?" ? In this case, art is not mimetic or decorative. Rather, it represents a form of philosophical investigation that is performed and embodied in performance. It's the aesthetic experience that is collective and ritualized. It is oriented towards harmony between human, natural, and divine realms. This framework undermines the Western dichotomy between aesthetics and metaphysics. The artistic expression is considered an ethical act to the extent that it fosters the realization of impermanence, communal responsibility, and reverence towards life. Mexican aesthetics thus inherits a whole indigenous orientation where art is a way of knowing and surviving historical vulnerability and not an object for detached contemplation. The Spanish conquest violently destabilized the indigenous aesthetic systems, bringing in European epistemologies that divided knowledge and reason, knowledge and embodiment, and art and knowledge. But Mexican aesthetics was not merely swallowed or disappearing or even derivative. It restructured itself in forms of hybridity and resistance. So, such an important figure in this change is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Although it is frequently interpreted within European and Baroque traditions, the poetic and philosophical work by Sor Juana is rooted in the realities of colonial Mexico and its epistemological struggle over authority, knowledge, and gender. In writings like Respuesta a Sor Filotea, Sor Juana advocates intellectual inquiry as an ethical and spiritual necessity, opposing the fact that women were excluded in the production of knowledge, and her poetry is consistently connected with aesthetic complexity and epistemic ambition. She elaborates metaphor and formal experimentations that are never practices of beauty, but reveals practices of the limits of dogma and hierarchy. According to Paz, The Baroque excess by Sor Juana is a form of resistance, where aesthetic density thinking serves as a form of resistance to power in an inherently constrained colonial system. More importantly, Sor Juana does not approach poetry as isolated ethics or ideology. Her work insists that the acts of knowing, writing, and sensing are inseparable. Her aesthetics in this scene aligns more closely with indigenous epistemologies rather than European rationalism. Mexican aesthetics is therefore not formed as a response to Europe, but rather a response to colonial violence through creative survival. The aesthetic questions are now politicized in the post-Mexican Revolution era. The philosophy of mestizaje developed by José Vasconcelos and Heinz, racial and cultural mixture as aesthetic and spiritual process rather than a biological fact. Vasconcelos theorizes mestizaje as an act of creative synthesis that can now produce new forms of meaning, identity, and sensibility. Although the work of Vasconcelos is controversial, it is a major contribution to the Mexican aesthetic since the work of places and art and culture are at the core of national regeneration. The aesthetic creation becomes a collective project in overcoming colonial fragmentation, in contrast to Western aesthetics, where the emphasis is frequently on the genius of the individual and the aesthetic autonomy of the form. Vasconcelos views art as a civilizational force which shapes the ethical and political futures. Aesthetics turn into the imagining of social unity without annihilating difference. Although Vasconcelos' vision has been charged with idealism or exclusivity, it still reflects a distinctly Mexican approach towards aesthetics as identity formation, which is grounded on historical struggle and not universal standards of beauty. Mexican muralism is perhaps the most explicit expression of aesthetics as a collective knowledge. Artists such as Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros rejected easel painting and private ownership in favor of monumental public art. Murals were intended to educate, remember, mobilize, so as to transform walls of sites of historical narration and ethical instruction. The murals of Rivera, such as those at the Secretario de Educación Pública, portray indigenous labor and revolutionary struggle and communal life not as an aestheticized image, but as an epistemic narrative that challenges elite historiography. The sheer visual form, large-scale, accessible, permanent, and in itself is a philosophy of aesthetics where art is a part of the people and serves as a shared archive of memory. In this case, aesthetics cannot be separated from politics and pedagogy. Beauty is not a criterion of the mural, but its ability to convey historical consciousness and promote collective identity. This is a clear contradiction of Western aesthetics principles of disinterest and autonomy. In the Mexican context, art that fails to engage social reality runs the risk of being meaningless. Mexican and Chicana intellectuals in the contemporary context extend this tradition through the focus on fragmentation, hybridity, and embodied knowledge. Mestiza Consciousness by Gloria Anzaldúa defines an aesthetic that is based off the border, geographical, cultural, and psychological. In Borderlands, La Frontera, Anzaldúa describes a creative expression of surviving contradiction and violence through the body and language. Despite being frequently categorized under Chicano studies, the work of Anzaldúa is heavily informed by indigenous Mexican cosmologies and language practices. Her aesthetics reject purity, coherence, or even formal harmony, in favor of ambiguity and pain as an epistemic principle. It is due to the fact that ethics, identity, and memory are held together in the lived experience that art becomes a site of resistance. Mexican aesthetics cannot be perceived in terms of Western concepts of beauty, autonomy, or the universality. In The Flower and the Song, including muralism and mestiza thought, Mexican aesthetic traditions consistently conceive the concept of art as a form of knowledge, entrenched in ritual history as well as a collective shared life. In this sense, aesthetics collapses as divisions between art, ethics, and metaphysics and politics, with meaning being grounded on lived experience and historical struggle. Mexican aesthetics are not solely derived by European philosophy, but more specifically on indigenous continuity, colonial rapture, and in addition to creative resistance. It is not what appears to be beautiful that matters, but what sustains this memory.